Welcome to this webinar for Courtauld 2025 Associate Members on food waste measurement. We'll be looking at how to define the scope of your food waste inventory. So in other words, what you're trying to actually measure. We'll cover the key definitions you need to know so you're consistent in your approach. And we'll touch on common approaches to food waste measurement and importantly, how to get going on the journey. So there are two broad sections we'll cover today. So firstly, we'll be looking at what needs to be measured in terms of the scope, as I mentioned, and making sure you're using the same definitions and language as others on the roadmap. Secondly, we'll be looking at how to measure in terms of common quantification approaches, how to get going even when you don't have 100% accurate or comprehensive data. And finally, we'll look at some additional resources that can support you with moving forwards on your journey. Before we get into it, I wanted to briefly clarify what we are not covering in this webinar because it's covered elsewhere in a separate webinar. And that's a walkthrough of the reporting templates, so the data capture sheet used by the roadmap. So that webinar covers a line-by-line guide walkthrough of that data capture sheet, looking at what you need to report, including details of the exact metrics you need to measure. So please do check out that webinar, and that one and this one work together to help you measure and report in a consistent way that conforms to the roadmap's best practice approach. We'll use this diagram as a framework for discussing how to define the scope of your food waste inventory that you're measuring. So this diagram was originally created as part of the Food Loss and Waste Standard, and RAP also has an editable template of this which you can use to create a simple consistent visual representation of your scope. It's not essential to use this diagram as the same information is captured on the data capture sheet, but it can help others at a glance to quickly understand your scope and put your reported measurements in context. And it's also just a useful structure to run through some of the key definitions and requirements for reporting. Okay, firstly, time frame. So the requirement is to report over a 12-month period, an annual period. That could be a calendar year or a fiscal year or some other annual period, as long as you're consistent. So clearly defining the start and end dates ensures that relevant comparisons and aggregations can be made. However, just because the reporting period is 12 months doesn't mean you should only have annual aggregates of data, of course. The recommendation is to measure on a much more regular, ongoing basis. And having more granular data over time, for example, by season, by month, by day, even potentially by shift or even within a process, if that was possible. Of course, that means more insight into hotspots and potential drivers of food waste, and therefore enables you to take more targeted and informed actions to reduce it. Okay, so next is material type. And the recommendation here is to include both food and the associated inedible parts of food, which I'll explain in a moment, in your food waste reporting. In most cases, these will likely be reported together as a single number for each of the required reporting fields, with your target applied to the combined total. However, for some businesses, it may be helpful to separately quantify inedible parts and food, particularly where opportunities to reduce or redirect the inedible parts may be limited. If businesses are able to separate out food and inedible parts, then that will allow them to set a target just on the food part, which is the scope of the SDG 12.3 target. But there's no requirement to separate out the totals in this way. Okay, so what do we mean by food and associated inedible parts? So food is defined very simply as any substance that is or was at some point intended for human consumption. Now, there's a few things to unpack in this. So first of all, it's worth saying that it includes drink as well. So although we talk about food waste, and obviously we have the food waste reduction roadmap, you should see food waste as a shorthand for food and drink waste. So that does include beverages as well. Secondly, it includes anything that was originally intended for human consumption. So even though something may have spoiled and no longer be fit for human consumption, if that was the original intention, then it's still defined as food for the purposes of reporting your food waste. It doesn't include pet food, unless you're redirecting food that was originally intended for human consumption. But if it was always intended to be eaten by animals or by pets, then it shouldn't be included in this. Obviously, that's something important to capture in terms of monitoring your waste in other areas, but it's not within scope of the food waste reduction roadmap. Secondly, it doesn't include things that are medicines essentially, so any drugs or medicines are out of scope for this. But it does include vitamins because vitamins are seen as a food supplement. And it also doesn't include processing agents that are used along the supply chain. So things like the water that you might cook food in as part of the processing, that would be out of scope for your reporting of food waste. But it does include any intrinsic water that's part of food at the point when it becomes food waste. Okay, so what about associated inedible parts? So these are intrinsic components of food that were never intended to be consumed by humans. So just a few examples here. That might include things like peel or bones or pits or stones, in certain types of fruit. And those are intrinsic, naturally occurring parts of the food that were never intended to be consumed by humans and are therefore defined as associated inedible parts. And just to say what that doesn't include, it doesn't include packaging. Obviously, that was not intended to be consumed by humans, but it's not an intrinsic, naturally occurring part of the food, so it's not counted as an associated inedible part and should just be excluded from your measurements of food waste completely. Also, just because something is no longer fit for human consumption, for example, because it's gone moldy, that doesn't make it an associated inedible part when it comes to food waste reporting. If it was originally intended for human consumption, even if it can no longer be fed to humans, then it should be classified as the food component of your food waste when you come to report your figures. It's also worth adding that it's up to businesses what they define within their own market context as food and associated inedible parts. So a classic example would be something like chicken's feet, where in some geographies, in some markets that's widely eaten and would therefore count as the food component. Whereas in other locations or markets, it may be that this isn't widely eaten and therefore, wasn't intended for human consumption for that particular market context. So it could be counted as an associated inedible part. Having said that, there are some common agreements around food and associated inedible parts for some sectors. And RAP has guidance, for example, for fresh produce and the meat sectors around this, where food and associated inedible parts are defined for some common product types. So please do look at those for best practice and consistency with the rest of your sector where appropriate. So next up is destination. And this is a list of destinations that you can send surplus food or food waste to. And just expanding the food waste destinations here, you can see definitions for these. So I'm not going to read through all of these. You can do so at your leisure. You can pause the webinar, or we've also got these detailed in more detail actually in our guidance on measurement document and in the data capture sheets as well. But make sure that you are familiar with obviously what all of the definitions are for these. So you make sure that you report your food waste against the correct destination. And these are designed to be fairly comprehensive. So this should capture, in terms of food waste destinations anyway, this should capture all of the destinations that you could send food waste to. So those food waste destinations form part of a hierarchy of destinations where you can send food waste to, and that's indicated on this diagram here from Champions 12.3, which aligns with the food waste hierarchy, which RAP uses as well. And you can see really a list of destinations that you can send food waste to, from most preferable at the top down to least preferable at the bottom. And anything below this dashed line is defined as food waste when it comes to interpreting SDG 12.3. So you can see not all destinations are equal, although all of the ones listed on the previous page do count as food waste destinations. So the goal is to obviously move things above the line, so to go from a food waste destination to another destination that's not a food waste destination, but If that's not possible, it would still be to move things up this hierarchy. So just to give you a bit more detail about the destinations above the line, so the non-food waste destinations. Firstly, the priority if you have surplus food that you can't sell through your normal channels would be to keep that in the human food supply chain, wherever possible, which was the original intention for the food, through redistribution. And that could be through charitable or commercial means. It's important to include in your food waste reporting template only food that would otherwise have ended up as waste under this destination, and where you're redistributing it to prevent it going to waste or to one of the other non-food waste destinations here. Secondly, if you're not able to redistribute it, the next best option would be to send the surplus food for animal feed. And again, it's important to only report food here that was originally intended for humans, so not food that was intended from the beginning to be, for pets or other animals. That would obviously not count as reducing food waste. And finally, the third option above the line would be biomaterial processing. So converting food or associated inedible parts into various industrial products with a market. And you can see some examples here. So, packaging fibers, bioplastics, cosmetics, and so on. So that's another option for where you can send surplus food to avoid it going to food waste when it comes to interpreting the SDG 12.3 target. And please note where this process, this biomaterial processing, results in the production of biofuel products, so biodiesels or fuel pellets, for example, from things like coffee grounds or used cooking oil. This should be reported as a food waste destination under the other destination, along with a clarifying note. So this shouldn't be reported under the bio-based materials biochemical processing destination here. And I'll refer you to, please see our guidance on biomaterial processing and also our guidance in the data capture sheet for more details on that. Okay, so next up is boundary, and there's a few different dimensions to this, which we'll unpack now. Okay, so first up is food category, and the intention should be to cover all food and drink products that you sell or that you handle. So really it's to include everything that you could potentially waste in your food waste inventory. It's okay to start off, for example, with a subset of your products or categories, perhaps in your first year of reporting, as you build your capabilities, which might align, for example, with just reporting against one particular site. But the intention should be over time to work your way up to including all sites, all categories, and all products that you sell. And of course, any that you do exclude, please be explicit about that when you define your scope in your data capture sheet, as you'll learn more about in that particular webinar. You should be clear about anything you're excluding. Okay, secondly, life cycle stage. So again, the intention is that businesses report for their own operations. So essentially reporting against food that you own, where you own the operations and have direct control over the food. And as you'll see, as part of the commitment to the roadmap, we do ask businesses to work together across their supply chain. So working with suppliers and customers and also looking at the impact on consumer or household food waste. Because businesses do have an impact and influence across the supply chain, and therefore only by working together are we going to be able to tackle that food waste end to end. But when it comes to data reporting, we're asking you to report data for food that you actually own, within your own operations. When it comes to geography, for the food waste reduction roadmap, we ask you to report an aggregated number for the UK as a whole. So for all of your sites and operations within the UK, you may be a global business with operations across different markets. And of course, by all means, take the same principles, which come from the global food loss and waste standard and apply them in your other markets. But all we ask for is that you break out the data for the UK separately when you report for the food waste reduction roadmap. And just to clarify as well, the data capture sheet that RAP uses is now aligned globally and used by the World Resources Institute and others when it comes to food waste reporting. And although you would be reporting an aggregate number for the UK, obviously it's best practice to understand what your food waste data is at a more granular level. So across regions, across different sites, for example, and that will enable you to identify hotspots and therefore take appropriate targeted actions to reduce your food waste. So you're aggregating data when you're reporting it, but you should be aiming for much more granular detail in terms of the data you have behind that. And finally, when it comes to organization, we just ask you to report the number and type of sites or facilities that are represented in your food waste inventory. So how many sites are you reporting against, and what are they? So for example, is it factories or warehouses, stores or restaurants, etc., depending on the nature of your operations. And again, the intention should be to report against all of them. But if you do exclude any because you're building your capabilities in your first year, for example, then just be explicit about that when providing the detail. So when it comes to reporting your own operations, as we said, you should be looking to do. There are some sort of tricky areas to sometimes work out whether something falls within your remit and should be within the scope of your food waste inventory. And these usually happen at the touch point between different entities. So between, for example, supplier and customer, or even customer and consumer in some cases. So what we want to make sure is we avoid double counting. For example, if different entities are reporting food waste, we don't want to count it twice, because that will cause issues with aggregation of data. At the same time, we don't want to let it fall into the gaps so that no one ends up reporting some of these areas. So what are some examples of what I'm talking about? So these might be things like supplier returns, where something's been delivered or there's been some over deliveries perhaps. So it hasn't gone onto the books of the customer, but it's still sitting within their warehouse or their operations, for example. Deliveries themselves, so when goods are in transit between, two entities. Customer bins sometimes, so there might be bins on the premises, but customers are using those bins. For example, they're not part of your operations exactly. Consignment stock, where a retailer will have stock cited within their warehouses, for example, and be responsible for managing that, but actually it's owned by the supplier. Consolidation centers in some cases, or concessions within your premises. There are also non-core areas as well of your operations, so things like internal staff canteens or cafeterias on some of your sites. And then there's also the issue of franchises in some cases, where you don't necessarily have ownership of the operations within your franchises, but you have some reputational responsibility for the food waste that occurs there. So rather than giving you an exact answer for all of these areas, because some of them are quite tricky, I'll just provide a few principles to help you determine whether or not to report against these. So I think the first thing is to say ownership of stock should be the primary determinant of whether you report, whether something's within your scope to report or not. So look at who actually owns the stock. But having said that, it's important to recognize where you have some responsibility for reporting that, because it's easier for you to report, for example, if it falls within your operations. And something like franchises might occur for that as well, because of the responsibility you have, the reputational responsibility you have for some of those franchises. The important thing as well is to have conversations with your trading partners. So ideally, everyone across the supply chain will be reporting their data, so you can kind of clarify some of these grey areas between you. It's also important, obviously, whatever you decide, to be explicit about it. So if you can put the detail about what's included or excluded in your scope when you report, then at least people can interpret the data properly. And also finally use that kind of principle of proportionality, so the principle of relevance from the food loss and waste standard, to prioritize where you focus on. So obviously you should be focusing your efforts to measure and manage the largest areas of food waste. That should be where your priorities fall as well. And finally, on the scope diagram, just a couple of other things to keep in mind. So first of all, packaging should always be excluded from the weight of your food waste that you report. If that's difficult to do, so if you're disposing of it with the packaging, there's various approaches to how to estimate the amount of packaging to be able to subtract that off. And I'll give an example later on as well. But look into different options for how to try and at least calculate or estimate what impact that's having, so you can report it without that. And the other thing is where you're reporting for farm waste, you should be excluding losses pre-harvest. So where things are not ready to be harvested, if they're wasted before harvest, then that doesn't count as food waste again as part of the roadmap. So just something to additional considerations to bear in mind. And here's just a real life example. This is from the Food Loss and Waste Protocol amongst their case studies. So there's one from Tesco. So this is a completed scope diagram that they submitted, which is used alongside the data that they then report so that it can be interpreted properly. So this is from a few years ago. You can see this is from the financial year 2016-2017. Both food and inedible parts were included in their inventory, in their scope. You can see the ticks against destinations show that all of those destinations were potentially in scope for them to report against, but the only ones they actually had food waste going to in that particular year were anaerobic digestion and controlled combustion. So that's why those have the green ticks. In terms of boundary, they're reported against all food and drinks that they sell. They've reported obviously their stores and depots, so their direct operations for the UK. And they put the detail there of how many stores and depots are actually included in that. And then as you can see, they've clarified that packaging weight has been excluded as expected. Okay, so that covers the what to measure in terms of your scope and the key definitions you need to be aware of. And as I mentioned, please use this webinar in conjunction with the walkthrough of the data capture sheet. Okay, so moving on to the how to measure, so looking at different measurement approaches. This table here comes from the Food Loss and Waste Accounting and Reporting Standard, and it outlines 10 different approaches quantification approaches to how you can actually measure your food waste data. And it's worth saying that there's no prescription within the Food Loss and Waste Standard or within the roadmap for how to measure your data. So there's different approaches that would be relevant and applicable to you in different circumstances. So you need to choose the one that's a best fit for you, that you're able to get the most accurate data on and provides you with what you need depending on your situation. So this table, as I said, lists 10 different potential options, and they're broken into sort of two sections. So one where you have direct access to the food waste, so you're able to directly measure it or at least approximate it. And the other three based on inference. So that's where you don't have direct access to the food waste itself to be able to measure it. So you have to infer its quantity through other means. So I won't read through all of these in a lot of detail, but just very briefly, those kind of direct methods include direct weighing, so where you can weigh the food waste yourself. That's obviously one of the most accurate methods. Counting, so that might happen, for example, in a retailer where you count the number of products or stock keeping units which are just wasted, and then cross-reference that with a database of weights, for example. Assessing the volume, where you're potentially wasting, for example, liquids, and the volume of that, and you can use the density to work out the weight. Waste composition analysis, where you have food waste mixed with other types of waste potentially. So you need to do some analysis to work out what proportion of that is food. And there's more detail on how to do that, for example, in the Food Loss and Waste Standard. Other types of records or diaries you might be maintaining, for example, waste transfer receipts, which can help you to calculate your food waste over time, or surveys that you might be conducting to get some more qualitative data to work out your food waste as well. And then in terms of the other methods by inference, so the most common of those would probably be a mass balance approach. So this could be used, for example, as one approach to how to measure your food waste to sewer. So that's where you would look at all the inputs, to your processes. So the weight of all your ingredients, all your inputs, and then the weight of all your outputs that you know about. And then the difference between them gives you how much has been obviously lost from the process and presumably wasted. And if you know some of the waste destinations, you can work out, or you can infer what remains must be going to the other waste destinations. There's also modelling as well you could do to try and work out your food waste or estimate your food waste. Or there's using proxy data. So that might be data from previous years or from other sites which you know make an assumption hold true, or you can adjust in some way to account for a different site where you're not able to directly measure your data. So yeah, look at the food loss and waste standard for more detail on some of these different approaches. So as I mentioned, there isn't a one single prescriptive approach for how to measure your food waste. You need to choose something that's appropriate for your particular situation. But there is a tool on the Food Loss and Waste Protocol website, so the Food Loss and Waste Quantification Method Ranking Tool. So it's an Excel tool into which you can answer a few questions. So things like, do you have direct access to the food waste? Is it in liquid or solid form? Does it include packaging, for example? So you can answer a series of questions, and then what it will do is it will rank the different approaches based on their suitability for your particular situation. So that's a good way of looking at what the best approach might be for your particular situation. Okay, when it comes to accuracy, you should be trying to understand any uncertainties in your data. So the principle of accuracy from the Food Loss and Waste Standard says that it's important to ensure that uncertainties are reduced as far as practical. So your goal should be to achieve sufficient accuracy to enable you to make decisions based on the data, essentially. So the data needs to be accurate enough to drive some of your decisions and to give you confidence that you're making the right decisions. So at the very least, we should be looking to understand from a qualitative perspective, what are some of those sources of uncertainty, and then to be explicit about those, because that will enable you to then try and work out what impact they're having and to see if you can reduce them further. So some of the sources of uncertainty might be things like compliance, for example, with putting waste in the right, in the right bins, for example. It could be to do with conversion factors that you're using. If you're doing sampling and then scaling that up for your whole site, for example, that could have an impact on accuracy. There could be some uncertainties around the accuracy of your equipment or access to your data. Or there could be other assumptions you're making when you come to do your calculations. So just work at trying to surface what those are and be explicit about them. Best practice where possible would be to try and actually put some figures against that. So to come up with some quantitative uncertainties. And that could be, for example, based on if there's a tolerance in your equipment, for example. So let's say it's accurate to plus or minus 2%. You could add that as a sort of confidence interval onto the data that you report. If you're doing sampling and scaling, for example, you can use this kind of calculation here, which again is a bit more detail on this in the Food Loss and Waste Standard, to enable you to come up with some confidence intervals in the data that you report. So you don't have to go to this degree of accuracy in terms of your understanding your uncertainties. It's best practice if you do, but the important thing is to really understand what is driving those uncertainties and what kind of impact are they going to be having on your accuracy so that you can improve things over time. One way to try and improve the accuracy of your data is to provide some assurance of it. And there's a few different approaches to this of varying degrees of complexity, but also of confidence in your data. So first up would be an internal review. And this is to make sure that your data has been reviewed by others in your business before you submit it. So that could involve looking for hotspots or outliers in your data, which may need to be double checked to make sure it's an accurate representation of your measurements and isn't a mistake, for example. It's a good idea to look for any large changes year on year and what might be driving those. And if possible, it would be to look at a couple of different approaches to measuring your food waste data and how close those come to each other, what explains the differences between them, for example. So that's one approach. Another option, or in addition, is that when you report your data to RAP, using a data capture sheet as part of your annual data submission, RAP will perform a basic sense check on this. So that's not a formal audit, but RAP will check that all of the required fields have been completed and call out anything missing or obviously anomalous. And then finally, there would be to do an external audit. It's worth saying there's no expectation or requirement for you to do this, but obviously if you're publicly reporting, for example, through your own channels, then the advice would be to get this audited. It's possible to use an external third party with relevant expertise to do an audit of your food waste data. Obviously, that would come at a cost, but it would provide the greatest degree of confidence in your data. And if you decide to do this, it's important to provide details in an assurance statement from the auditor or from the third party, just to explain what's actually been verified and what their findings are. Having said all that, I think it's really important to encourage businesses, no matter what your capabilities or experience, to get going on the journey as soon as you can. So it's important to emphasize you don't need perfect data or measurement processes to be able to start measuring and reporting your food waste data. So it's important to start by looking at what data have you already got that you could report, and that you can then build on to make improvements over time. So just some examples of approaches that you can take if you don't have completely comprehensive or accurate data. So you could, for example, start with a limited trial. So you could just do something for one of your sites, for example. You could just do it for a period of time. So like a pilot, just to measure data over a period of time and use that to make an estimate for how much waste you're generating across the year. You can use approximations or averages, again, being explicit about those. Estimates and assumptions can be used and often are needed as well to be able to accurately measure your data. It may require some sampling and scaling up, extrapolation across your sites. And you may need to make exclusions, to make a start to get going. As I say, you don't have to necessarily measure your entire estate from the get-go. With all of these, although they're valid approaches to sort of making a start, I think just a few principles to be aware of. So number one, whatever you decide and whatever your approach is, you need to be explicit and transparent about that. And that will enable people to understand and interpret your data accurately, but also for you to get some support around how to make improvements. It helps you to surface assumptions, so you need to make sure that you are aware of what assumptions you're making. Also, as I've already talked about, where you can, list out those uncertainties so that you're aware of them and can try and reduce them over time. Obviously, within the constraints that you're measuring and that you're being explicit about, you do need to be as accurate as you can within those constraints. And then the key thing is, don't just settle with that, but actually have a plan to improve that and to be more accurate as you can over time. And just one final bit on this as well. So, if you're struggling for how to get going with some things, WRAP does have some industry averages you could use, for example, to get you going. So as an example, we've got some data on average packaging weight, for example, within products. So if you're not able to take your packaging out, as a fallback, you could use an estimate from WRAP. Or when it comes to redistributed food, there's broad consensus within the industry on what the weight of a redistributed meal is, so what the weight per meal is, because often that's reported by charities, for example, in terms of number of meals actually redistributed. So again, if you don't have more accurate data, you can use some of these industry averages from WRAP. Okay, and just finally, just some pointers towards some additional resources to help you with your measurement. So first thing I wanted to highlight was on the Roadmap website, we do have sector-specific guidance. So if you're in one of these sectors, in meat, dairy, in retail and fresh produce, a grower potentially, or in hospitality and food service industry, we do have some specific sector-specific guidance for you to help you with measurements. So some key considerations for your sector. So please do check those out, as well as obviously the more generic guidance we've got. If you're a food manufacturer, one resource to help you get going on the journey, if you're right at the start of your food waste measurement and reduction journey, would be our Your Business's Food campaign. So within this, there is some really useful tools and resources. So for example, there is a checklist as you walk around your operations to look at things you can improve, and gives you questions you can ask to try and identify drivers of food waste. There is a food waste review sheet to help you track that over a period of time. And a cost calculator so you can work out the impact that that's having on your business as well. So yeah, so if you're at the start of the journey, as I said, as a food manufacturer, do look at Your Business's Food. Meanwhile, for hospitality and food service businesses, Guardians of Grub offers free practical tools to empower colleagues to reduce the amount of food thrown away in the business. So this is all about making simple, low-cost changes to the way food is bought, prepared, and served. And there's a suite of free operational resources that businesses can use to tackle food waste, including information posters, how-to guides, and a free calculator to record the changes that are being made. And there's also a new e-learning course, Becoming a Champion, that's been developed by professionals in the industry and will help upskill you and take your food waste reduction skills to the next level. That's it for this webinar. Thanks very much for listening. Do check out the Food Waste Reduction Roadmap website and the associate member platform for more resources and webinars like this to support you on your food waste reduction journey. And if you require any further one-to-one support or training on this topic, then please contact us and we'd be happy to discuss a proposal on this with you.